Off by introducing my panel here. So again, we covered today, or will have covered, 5 of the 10 chapters in the book. The first panel was a combination of 2, and we're now dealing with this which in some ways is the most interesting question in the book, this question about who will rule the internet in 2020. And I should explain again here that the origin of this book really was built around the next digital decade and around celebrating the first 25 years of .com. And as I mentioned, Shane Tews was our great patroness at VeriSign for this project. And this is really the last part of their celebration of the first 25 years of the .com registry. That anniversary was March, I believe, 15th of 1985. So we're just finishing the last year after that anniversary. And we decided that instead of trying to look 25 years into the future, we would look just 10 years into the future and ask the big questions about that decade and then who would rule in that. So I've mentioned Shane Tews. Shane runs the government affairs program at VeriSign, but she's not just your typical DC lobbyist type. She actually herself has worked in the think tank community and knows more about internet governance and ICANN than probably anybody who actually lives here, which is a pretty tall order. She and Chris Wolf, who is at Hogan Lovells and runs their privacy and information management group, they're going to be essentially providing real-world grounding, real-world application for what in some ways is a very philosophical discussion between 2 giants in the field, David Johnson and Milton Mueller, both of whom have essays in the book. David joined New York Law School's faculty in 2004 and teaches in their School for Information Law and Policy. He's also been affiliated with the Center for Democracy and Technology. Milton teaches and does research in the political economy of communications and information. His classic book, Ruling the Root, The Internet Governance and the Taming of Cyberspace, is something that everyone here should read. And he has a new book due out soon. Or is it just out?
It's out.
It's just out, and I think there may be a book launch event on that at Cato soon. Oh, and here's the book. Shane is master of books. It's called Networks and States, The Global Politics of Internet Governance. So I want to open this by asking David to explain his chapter and then Milton to explain his, but I think you'll see why they pair so well and why their again, philosophical approach actually is quite relevant for the real world of policy that goes on here every day, that people like Chris, who are lawyers at big firms, and people like Shane, who are actually at companies trying to deal with these issues. I think their articles really provide a framework for understanding how those things will play out in the next digital decade. So, David, why don't you start us off?
Thanks very much. I feel I should position myself by saying that I'm an optimistic, exceptionalist communitarian. The question I was given to write about was who will govern the internet, and I fought the question from the start by saying, actually, the question is, will the internet change the way we govern ourselves? Because the question about governance is really about relationships between people and how rules that constrain them get made. I make the point that the early John Perry Barlow exceptionalist claim to be left alone and claim that nothing could be done to regulate the net is very different from the argument that David Post and I made, which is that the net is sufficiently different in key characteristics that it will likely develop a form of governance that differs from that we apply in entirely physical and local geographical settings. And I still think that is going to happen and is happening for several different reasons. One, as I mentioned in the question I asked earlier, it's inherently global. And what that does is change the nature of the polity that has to be governed and the group of people whose consent might be needed to create a legitimate government. Now, you might think that that points in the direction of world government and voting on a global scale, and so another point in the article is that the mechanisms by which we make known what we want the rules to be will be different. And my phrase for this would be attention governance, or maybe attention and effort governance. But the argument is that since most things online don't matter unless people pay attention to them, and indeed most Corporations and other forms of social organization don't exist unless we all agree to pretend that they do. There is a highly constraining force that each one of us has in equal measure, and so that leads back to a reflection on de Tocqueville's analysis of America in the age of non-concentrated newspaper media and what he called the new equality of condition. And you may have seen on a panel yesterday that the Pew Internet Project just released a poll that contains amazing numbers, very large numbers of people who are using the internet to engage in civic and social groups, and who say in very large numbers that the internet has a major impact on their ability to do so. And one of the aspects of that study is that the groups, they join groups and form groups for purposes, to accomplish purposes in the world, to do things they couldn't do alone. And to me, that is the fundamental mechanism behind attention governance, and it will cause the net to create essentially increasing complexity in the social order. This is something we don't have a lot of data on yet, but Pew is beginning to get it. And so in addition to being global, the net is creating a set of social organization and order that gives people more choices. They can become involved in more groups and become empowered in many more different ways. The comments about the vegan media sites as one example, but in many other ways. And because the reason people join groups is to form goals, and because the internet is global, we can form goals, purposes, collectively on a global level. So what this fundamentally, the challenge this raises, and it's raised not only with reference to local sovereigns' efforts to impose regulations or to leverage intermediaries to impose rules, is fundamentally one of the consent of the governed. We've had an ongoing debate with Tim Wu and Joel Reidenberg and others about the theory that governments ought to be able to use technological means to reach out to enforce their policies anywhere in the world. And the recent legislation in Congress is our own version of what France was doing.
You're referring there to COICA.
COICA, right? Yeah. And my view of that is that that there's a distinction that needs to be made between law and war. Fundamentally, if you use whatever control power you have to impose your will on others, but do so in a way that doesn't involve them in deciding what the rules ought to be, you can do it, but it's war, not law. And so the challenge for global internet governance is how to create something that is more like a rule of law, more involving of the consent of the governed. And that, of course, the hope for something like that is not really lie in international treaties or government action. It lies in the direction of enabling people to come together online to do things that are not imposing harms on others, but merely governing their own affairs, and then for governments generally to defer to that kind of rule set. So the long-term trajectory that I see here is that we will end up doing a lot more governing of ourselves, and we will be doing it by deciding where to direct our attention and effort, and which intermediaries sets of rules to adopt, whether because they're good enough and convenient, or because they reflect our personal goals of wanting to accomplish things in groups. It's very instructive to go back and read Tocqueville, because his vision of the exceptional character of America was the power of associational life. He was contrasting France, in which any problem was to be solved had to be solved by the decisions of an aristocrat, in effect, and the power was concentrated in Paris, and the citizenry more or less gave up on trying to improve their condition, which he suggests ultimately led to the particular character of the French Revolution. It's also useful to go back and look at Athens. I recently read a book that explains Athenian democracy based not on high-minded theory, but on the fact that they, in order to protect themselves from the Persians and other city-states, they had to create a very large fleet of triremes, which, as you may recall, have a lot of oars. And so everybody had to row the boats together. So to me, the lesson here is a long-term trajectory that I would argue will continue, because once people are empowered, they don't easily go back and give up the idea that they can govern their own affairs, and that in 2020 and beyond, the internet will be governed, or we will be governed by ourselves.
So David, is it fair to say that the two key elements of your view are that we have the ability to sort ourselves into these communities, to choose, to, if you will, vote with our feet or our clicks, but also once we're in those communities to help to shape them in a way that reflects our own preferences?
Yeah, so I'm very mindful that there was various comments about the power of network effects and how people may, the ability of people to move from one place to another, or to have a voice within the intermediary or the Facebook site or whatever, are limited. I think that's problematical, but not nearly as problematical as the fact that the people who are being controlled by the laws of a country they don't even live in, or by the rules established by an intermediary that's based in a country that they don't live in and doesn't share their values. So I'm not saying this is necessarily easy, or that there won't be setbacks along the way, but it is the essence of the question of government and governance is always about how do we widen the circle of people who participate, how do we call on people to show civic virtue, and we've been there before, and it's we're at an inflection point. I think the Pew poll shows where people are in fact using these tools to re-engage.
Well, Milton, David's laid out a pretty, in my view, fascinating, compelling vision of netizenship, and one to which I'm very sympathetic, whatever, communitarian, whatever you want to call it. How does your own view compare to that? How does it differ?
Yeah, David described himself as an optimistic, exceptionalist communitarian. And if I had to adapt that vocabulary, which I don't, I would say I'm an optimistic, exceptionalist libertarian. And he knows that. Right? We have these communitarian, libertarian debates all the time, but fundamentally we agree on the fundamental approach to the governance of the internet and the governance of ourselves insofar as the internet alters that. And I think the one thing I would want to emphasize a bit more than David did is the need to get out of the concept of U.S. centrism when talking about the internet. So much of the discussion here has been about U.S. policy, about the intricacies of the Federal Communications Commission, and I think David hit the nail on the head when, in discussing with the gentleman from the Department of Justice, all of his attitudes towards the use of intermediaries completely ignored the fact that this is a global network, and so many of the businesses are transnational in scope, and that is in fact a good thing that we ought to be encouraging. And this, the real difference between me and David is that I'm looking at it more from the standpoint of a social scientist with an institutionalist conceptual framework. So what I see when I look at internet governance is the change in the nature of the nation state. And again, I really like the battle cry of the exceptionalists. I like John Perry Barlow's Declaration of Independence, not because it is a literal statement of fact that the internet cannot be governed, but because it creates a vision that maybe we can actually transcend sovereignty and the nation state as a form of governance and do something bigger and, again, if you're hopeful or optimistic, maybe even better. So in the book that they mentioned, Networks and States, I make the case that this is happening. And we've got to pull our noses out from making the assumption of nationalism and look at what is actually happening globally, because there are 200 some other countries out there passing laws, and many of them are not particularly friendly to the United States or to U.S. values. So if we look at the governance of the infrastructure, at the names and numbers, we already know that we have created an entirely new transnational private sector-based governance regime, for better or worse. Okay, we have created something that's new, and this has sparked a tremendous battle between intergovernmentalism and nationalism and transnationalism, which has been played out in the World Summit on the Information Society and is still being played out with the gradual encroachment of the Governmental Advisory Committee and its assertion and more control over what ICANN does. We also see, and David touched on this, so I'll give it short shrift, the formation of communities, transnational communities. And we also see all kinds of trans-jurisdictional regulation problems which are creating the kind of governance innovations, one of which is this focus on intermediaries. And now I'd like to turn back briefly to that brief interchange that David had with the man from the Department of Justice. So I wish I could remember his name. I'm really bad.
Josh Goldfoot, and I want to emphasize for his benefit that he was speaking, of course, only in his personal capacity.
Right.
Probably
That's
be
why
very
I should remember his name. So forget about that Justice Department stuff. And Josh said, all of you people in Russia and Europe and Latin America who joined Facebook, when we as the U.S. government want to regulate Facebook and impose our rules on you, rules which you have no voice in the formation of, our elected officials have no accountability to you because you're not U.S. citizens. Tough luck. You chose to join Facebook, and we feel perfectly legitimate in imposing our rules on them as an intermediary. Now, I'm not going to judge that statement from a normative standpoint. All I want to do is point out how it's a self-fulfilling prophecy in the debate over internet exceptionalism or globalism. You say governments have the ability to control the behavior of a local intermediary. Therefore, the local intermediary reorganizes itself along national lines and sacrifices non-local interests in order to comply. And then non-exceptionalism becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy because you have created it. So that doesn't prove anything about what should be. That may tell you a lot about the interests and power of nation states, but it doesn't tell us what the vision for the internet should be. And I think what both David and I are trying to articulate is a more transnational, globalist philosophy, the idea that our institutions can evolve, the idea that the nation state is historically specific, that it came into being at a specific time in history and can just as well go out of existence, at least in certain sectors. Doesn't mean we don't need government, doesn't mean we don't need governance. It simply means that we don't need to get stuck on a particular institution and wave the flag and think of ourselves as Americans first rather than, as David said, and as I really try to make the point in the book, a new polity, a new collective entity for creating and enforcing policy.
Well, I want to start talking about how this applies in the real world, but I also want to say that you've both done a great job of really explaining why we chose these three panels today, and the theme really, as you've all heard today, is this underlying question of internet exceptionalism. Is the internet different? How can and should the internet be governed in the future? So when you think about these, and when you read the book, or at least my introduction, which is kind of the Cliff's Notes version, I think you'll see that these questions really run throughout all the essays here, and these are all questions that have a very real bearing on law and policy, just as you were hearing Milton talk about. So, David, do you want to respond to Milton before we get
I think I want to respond to your characterization of what's real and what's not real.
Oh, well, I don't. I'm a think tank guy. I love Tocqueville. I'm not saying it's not real. I'm trying to tie it into everyday debates.
Right, and I guess I agree with Milton. I think he puts it very well. I want to point you to the work of Paul Schiff Berman, who has written about cosmopolitan pluralism. And the main point he makes is that whenever anyone, whether it's an intermediary or a social group or a state, asserts jurisdiction over a particular action or dispute, it's claiming that it's the best situated to resolve that dispute. And with the growth of the internet, we have a lot more people claiming jurisdiction. His point is that there's no real reason why a private entity that's controlling the levers of area of the network, for example, is less entitled to claim jurisdiction over a particular dispute than a government that happens to be the residence of some of the participants. So it's all about how do you go about choosing when should one jurisdiction defer to another, and let it set the applicable rule. We have a long history in this country of the government deferring to the private sector's self-organizational efforts when it's working and when it's congruent in the sense that the rules are mostly affecting people who are intended to be benefited. That's how we got the
So
securities
is
exchange.
that your standard? This is really critically important. This is exactly how you apply this, what might seem like a philosophical conversation, to everyday policy.
right.
It's deciding when to intervene. What you just said is it affecting the people who are being governed by that system? But I think this is probably worth elaborating on. I mean, tell us, if you're talking to a policymaker, what is the standard that you would suggest they apply?
I would say that you should ask, what is the universe of people affected by a rule, whether it's a rule being set by an online site or by a foreign government ever. What's the universe of people affected, and how much does that overlap with those who are intended to be benefited? So at the extremes, Al-Qaeda is a very non-congruent operation, and I don't have any problem with the government saying we can...
Regulating Al-Qaeda?
Right. We have the ability to shut them down. At other extremes, the private equity markets would be an example for sophisticated investors in which you would say, look, these guys can protect themselves, they're making rules, they're writing their own contracts, we don't have to deeply regulate that. And
so it's really about empowerment to self-government.
Exactly.
Good. Well, Shane, so you live in the world of ICANN, the domain name system. Do you want to maybe briefly, for some of the people in the audience who aren't as familiar with that, just provide a short introduction as you can manage?
Sure, I can do that, but I actually want to go back to this dialogue because it's a real challenge when you're talking to policymakers. There isn't an exact, place to say it's like this because people like analogies. And so the closest I can get, usually if it works, is maritime law. Because you have to say, okay, at some point that ship is no longer in your governed waters and, is what's in the ship. And you can kind of go through that to a certain point and then it falls apart. But, it's as close as you can get to people that really want things to be practical. And they don't get to take the time to think through these things or just don't choose to spend the time doing it, which is why you all reading books and you all staying here for most of you for the second day of a 2-day tech conference is really important because we need to be the ones that go and explain a lot of this to them. So from a practical standpoint, when you're the world of ICANN, which I have to just say on a personal note, Roger Cacchetti is in the back of the room, and if he hadn't done the fortunate decision of hiring me almost 10 years ago, March 4th, 2001, I wouldn't even be here. And when I started, they were talking about ICANN, I thought, I'm never going to care about that. And that's all I think about now all the time. So for those who are not into ICANN speak, there's something called the GAC, which it took me about 4 years to be able to say that without laughing. And it stands for the Government Advisory Committee. And a lot of what I spend my time doing is doing kind of practical translation between the Government Advisory Committee and the other committees and the groups that are there. And when I started regularly going to the GAC meetings, a lot of the business people were like, well, why? Why are you doing that? And I said, well, this new top-level domain thing you guys are working on so diligently in these other committees, which is coming, hopefully, to fruition. I said, the GAC's the ones that are going to slow you down.
And just for the non-ICANN people here, that's top-level domains is things like .blog, for example.
.steve, .dog.
And ICANN is the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers that coordinates these functions.
And they couldn't understand why in the world these government people were going to slow down because they had all these brilliant ideas and nobody cared about government and the Internet's all about not being governed. And then they came out with a concept of morality and public order. And now all of us in the ICANN world are living through that entertaining world right now, which is, if they want to block, can they block? Which then gets into a lot of the other discussions you guys were having earlier today and does kind of go into COICA is too. Who gets to choose what you see, when you see it, and how much liberty do you really have around that? So this whole discussion is really taking place in a microcosm, what it might appear to you. For the rest of some of us, it's our entire life. Of how do you decide, who has the rules around this, and it becomes a very hard edge really fast. And when our own government, the U.S. government, starts choosing how to do these things in a way that we don't want to see emulated in other countries, it makes them really unhappy when you say, just take out U.S. and put in China. They almost just tell you to leave their office. They're like, just leave. You're not being practical. And you're like, well, where am I wrong on that? So it's from a practical perspective, we're at a point in time where some major decisions are going to be made that will decide where this goes or not. And usually my parting note when I'm I'm lobbying and they don't seem to be paying attention, I'll go, I just hate to be back here in 5 years and say, remember the internet? It was so cool. And then they kind of, think that I'm a, smart ass. But then usually they call me back and say, well, okay, what was this you were talking about again? I don't think I exactly understood it.
So Milton, what I find most fascinating about Milton's argument is that his argument is not just an argument, that it's actually descriptive, that this is already happening. Mm-hmm. So can you tell us if the extent to which you see that happening and what the challenges are for Milton's vision actually coming to fruition?
Yeah, you're seeing a lot of divisions. A lot of people don't think that privacy exists. We believe, there's iterations of that. One of the things that I follow more out of just wanting to see lessons learned and wanting to be a student of very near history is the European Commission's Internet of Things conference. And you want to see how the internet could have turned out terribly wrong. Here's a fantastic technology on near-field communication and RFID that could do all this amazing stuff. And really, I just want to do a receiptless return because I shop a lot. But they're using the precautionary principle and they're stopping it in Europe. And I've actually been in meetings in Asia where I've said, you guys just need to everything's coming from China, so why don't you just start it and then everybody will follow. And they keep saying, well, they want this utopian idea that everybody's going to get on board one concept and it's going to be all organized. But the Europeans are very excited to make sure it gets stopped in its tracks. So even though I'm watching that because I'm very interested in that particular technology, I'm really watching it as a stalking horse to see what could potentially happen in the internet space and what really could have happened if we'd had internet interference or government interference much earlier in this process. So that makes us very fortunate that they really didn't pay attention for quite a while in the space.
So Chris, you're here to represent the other half of the practical community here in Washington, which is practicing lawyers who are actively involved in policy. What's your perspective on the extent to which, as Milton suggests, this is already happening or that it should happen?
So I won't be true to form, and I'll restrict myself to things I may know something about.
Well, because you're not a law professor, right?
We actually have a.
It's after 4. Come on, we're all having a good time.
We have a table in our cafeteria in our law firm where the Chief Justice Roberts used to preside when he was a partner in our firm, and before him, Senator Fulbright. And there is a rule there that you can't talk about anything you know about during lunch, which of course doesn't stop anybody.
So you guys talk about sports.
And so, the older partners in the firm and now Senator Warner and Bob Michael who sit there for lunch every day just talk about anything, right? So I'm not going to do that because I'll talk about two things I know a little bit about, which is privacy and hate speech on the internet. And I think both of those, illustrate both of your points. One, that we will be governed by ourselves, and Milton, your point about internationalism. For 15 years, I've been working intensely on the issue of hate speech on the internet, anti-Semitism, racism, homophobia, intolerance generally, which in a country with the First Amendment is a pretty tall order. And I even chaired a group called the International Network Against Cyber Hate and went to conferences all over Europe and had the French Minister of Justice, recently retired at the time, yell at me, stop hiding behind the First Amendment. And most recently, as if I could change that. And most recently, I was asked, why do you keep, beating your head against the wall, knowing that anything goes in the United States on the internet thanks to the First Amendment, and while we have laws in Europe that prohibit hate speech, they haven't done anything because of the United States rules. And it's because I really do see a gradual move towards us governing ourselves in this area, particularly after the episodes of cyberbullying, which really brought this into sharp focus with respect to what intolerance and hate-filled speech is doing to our kids. You see people looking at the idea of maybe we should have greater civility. And this involves the role of intermediaries, which may be a taboo subject to some of the folks in this crowd, I don't know. But you see, for example, mainstream newspaper sites cutting off debate when it really takes a right turn and gets incredibly hate-filled. You see terms of use being enforced more vigorously. You even see the notion of anonymity, which is so sacrosanct on the internet, being questioned. And the question of free expression being balanced against the right of human dignity to be free from attack, because that in fact chills other people's rights to participate. And I really am hopeful that we are beginning to govern ourselves when it comes to hate speech, and that there is emerging a universal standard. I don't think we're going to see an elimination of hate speech, but I think we're going to see more attention to it. And in 10 years, I'm hoping that we'll see a better environment for the next generation of netizens. And I think part of the problem, by the way, has been the abdication by digital immigrants to digital natives who have run amok when it comes to expressing themselves on the internet in ways that, while the First Amendment may tolerate, we should discourage. In the privacy front, I actually see a convergence, even though, indeed, in Europe they have much stricter rules and much more bureaucratic rules and much more administrative rules, which have some absurd results, like thwarting the development of the Internet of Things that could be really beneficial. I think we take a much more balanced approach to weighing benefits and burdens of regulation when it comes to privacy. But I've spent a lot of time recently. I was in Jerusalem at the Data Protection Authority's conference in October. I was with the European Data Protection Supervisor in December, and this morning I was with John Leibowitz, the chair of the FTC, and there's remarkable similarity in approach to the issue of privacy. The fundamental issues, the fair information practice principles that were developed by the Department of Health and Human Services and that form the basis of the OECD framework for privacy are quite similar. Now, our approaches to achieving them are different, but I think we all share the same kinds of concerns about personal control over the use of our information. And I actually presented a paper in Jerusalem that, kind of poked a finger a little bit in the eyes of the Europeans, saying, our framework may not be pretty, and there may be overlap, and there may be some gaps, and we don't have a uniform privacy law. But, with the FTC and state attorneys general and some plaintiffs' lawyers on the beat, companies have done a pretty good job. There's a paper from Berkeley professors Bamberger and Mulligan that concluded that, looked at privacy in '94 and privacy today. But I think the point is that without any one nation really controlling how privacy is to be regulated on the internet, there is a commonality that is emerging, which achieves, I think, a degree of the internationalism that Milton was talking about.
So Milton, Chris is describing convergence across global boundaries along to certain regulatory goals. Is that what you have in mind when you talk about a denationalized liberalism? And how would you deal with the kinds of concerns he's getting out of privacy and hate speech and online defamation?
Well, I think that there's a positivistic and a normative approach to this. So in terms of describing what's actually happening, I think, yes, you do see some of this, particularly, you do see some convergence on common principles, which in fact are not domestic U.S. ones, particularly on hate speech, in fact. For example, the morality and public order rules that are going to emerge from the ICANN process, which is a form of regulating content or censorship of the top-level domain space, these rules are going to be more in line with his views and less in line with the more libertarian view that I hold, simply because ICANN feels like it has to get that consensus on a global basis. And so you're dealing with a situation where you not only have governments, but you have a wide variety of cultures in the world who are very afraid, usually irrationally afraid, that some kind of top-level domain will be created that they don't like or that threatens them. So, yes, when you create global institutions, and this is something we should be very aware of, you will have, as an objective positivistic statement, you will tend to get convergence on some kind of common norms in that institution.
But as a normative matter, is that what you want? Is that denationalized liberalism as you see it?
No, not perfectly. I think what you want, or what I would want to get from a normative standpoint, is some kind of convergence on the idea that the rules and institutions need to protect us from governments and other forms of incursions on power, that they need to create a space for freedom of action. And if they're going to tilt the balance, on questions like civility versus freedom, I would probably be more on the side of tolerating some nasty things in order to have more freedom, rather than the other way around.
So what if the balance were struck in the way that you just suggested? And by the way, I share your view. I think more speech and counter speech is the way to deal with incivility on the internet. But there is a line that can be crossed where people really are hurt, where people are discouraged from exercising their own right to free expression. Isn't there a point where consensus can be reached globally that there's certain categories of speech that really shouldn't be tolerated?
Well, sure, there are probably some areas where there would be widespread agreement on something being so outrageous and unjustifiable that any given government or intermediary ought to act against it. But I just want to point out that even if Milton loses that battle, all that morality and public order rule will control is the use of a string as the top-level domain. The ultimate principle that was we attempted to build into ICANN was that the domain name system, which is the ultimate intermediary leverage of power, should not be used to control content that happens to be hosted on a site, or even how you allocate second and third level strings.
Right, and I'm not quarreling with that. I really am talking about other.
David, when you
other
say
rules.
strings, let's just be clear. You mean the particular combination of letters that goes into like a .sex or something .sex.
Right. I mean, the greatest threat is the effort by local governments, including the proposal that's going through Congress, to use the resolution of domain names and the powers of ISPs to filter things, and in addition to the payment mechanisms, to enforce, in effect, content regulation. And I agree that we should have a continuing conversation globally about what our rules are. I just think that once you get beyond some baseline unjustifiable actions, you're going to have disagreements, and we have to figure out how to, allow diversity.
So going back to a quick practical point there, when the .com, the people who were running .com in the very early time, there were really no rules. They weren't thinking about the morality and protocol order. They tried to not do the Carlin 7 dirty words, and they did their best because they thought, well, let's just try that. Well, it turned out that once more foreign entities were interested in registering domain names, it just was impossible. You had to do it because so many of them were actually, part of the chain of a sequence of words that were most likely foreign. So it was one of those, like, they tried. They didn't want to offend somebody, but they realized that wasn't going to work, and they probably got several people yelled at them, but, they got over it. And so, you're now in this sort of challenge of trying to do your level best is just being, kind of a practical and not wanting to harm anyone, versus trying to meet the case of everybody's litmus test as to, what exists in each country as being the hurdle at the top tier versus the bottom tier makes a vast amount of difference, and that's part of the challenge we're getting into now.
So I want to ask Milton the same question, Shane, but what is the same question I asked to David? What is the standard that you think should be followed in deciding when it's appropriate for government or governments in some transnational way to set a rule?
I mean, I don't have an answer to this. Right now, what I'm dealing with is people thinking they can just block at a certain level, which a lot of times, your ISP is actually a national entity, and so we have a differing issue as to, so some of them can just practically do that. But as we're delving into it, what we're trying to say is that's not the elegant solution that it appears to be, similar to the COICA bill. I mean, it is well intended. You're trying not to harm people, but along the way, collateral damage happens. Sometimes it's just a matter of something may not be on the web, but it also means that you might incur technical issues along the way, which is what I'm trying to protect it from, is saying by doing a well-intended act, you may end up inadvertently causing technical damage that's hard to reverse. So there's a couple different issues going on there.
So, yeah, I'll pick up on that question. So that's why a normative battle basically has to be waged on the basis of some kind of modernized variant of liberal ideology, that we have to take the concept of liberalism with its deep roots in ideas of freedom of conscience and freedom of expression and freedom of thought, and globalize that. And that has to be very explicit and open. It can't just be an implicit sort of extension of U.S. values into the rest of the world. It has to be explicitly engaged with the rest of the world, which you'll discover very quickly is not frequently very receptive to liberal ideas, both in economics and in culture.
Well, Milton, how would that deal with copyright infringement? You can certainly express yourself by using other people's copyrighted content, but we don't allow that, or at least we have laws against that in the United States, and we have lots of colleagues around the world in the family of nations that don't allow it either.
Oh, well, I think copyright is a good example of a kind of a property right created by the state, which is very limited and should be limited, and has a particular rationale for protecting it in certain instances and not protecting it in others. What's happened is a classic case of rent-seeking, in which the special interest group that thrives on copyright protection has, through this sort of diffuse costs and concentrated benefits logic, has extended the concept of copyright to ridiculous lengths, so that instead of being protected for 10 or 20 years, as you should be, you're protected for, 75 years plus your lifetime, which has no relationship to encouraging creativity. It's just absurdly long.
Well, that may be, but I'm talking about something that was created yesterday, and an artist's recording, instead of being purchased at Amazon, is being shared online for free.
Right. Well, that should be controlled in some way, but you have to do it in a way that does not subordinate other rights and does not make the internet into a panopticon in which everything you're doing is surveilled and controlled simply because one particular rights holder somewhere might be undermined by it.
And I would point out that there are differences in the interests of various countries. When we were a young country developing, we didn't think that the British copyright laws were very advantageous, and they were widely circumvented. Obviously, our laws reflect the dominant influence of people who want to protect intellectual property, but other countries are trying to build education systems without incurring the costs at the level that they can't afford. And
yeah, but that's not where the major infringement's going on. It's going on in China, copying software and music and videos.
Actually, most of the copyright infringement is occurring right here in the U.S. Let's not blame the Chinese for that one.
That's right.
I want to take questions from the audience, but let me ask you each. The title again of this chapter is "Who Will Rule the Net?" and I want to hear, in a way you've all been answering that question, but I want to hear as close as you feel comfortable making, not a specific prediction, but generally, where do you think that internet governance is going over the next 10 years? What ideas do you think will actually make these decisions, so that when Shane goes to talk to somebody at ICANN or the GAC, there will be a certain intellectual climate that they're operating in that will be different from today? David?
Well, if I had to be predictive, I see three different levels. For those things where there's very broad global agreement that certain actions are wrongful, unjustifiable, and so forth, I think there may well be either treaties or just de facto cooperation to use the levers of the system to prevent that kind of activity. In the intermediate case where there are legitimate differences about values and so forth, it may well be that we will have a partially partitioned net in which certain things that are hosted in particular countries are allowed to exist there, and people can visit the same way you can travel to Paris and abide by French law, but there will be a heterogeneity of the regulatory regimes. The longer term, the longer you go out, the more I think we will also see an increasing complexity of private sector governance, hopefully involving rules that are voluntarily adopted or participated in by those who are subject to them, and that the long-term trend is for the increasing complexity of the social order. So you could no longer convince yourself that if we just come to the right decision about a law passed by the U.S. Congress, we have figured out what the rules should be. In fact, it will be more complex and participatory than that.
That sounds like Adam's evolutionary dynamism.
Yes.
Milton?
Well, as you know, I tried to avoid making any predictions, and I wrote it into my book chapter, so I presented two extreme scenarios. One of them sort of an extreme intensification of national control and sort of a reinforcement of the old order of governmentality, in which the internet is subordinated to that, and another one of this extreme of denationalized liberalism. Now, in terms of predictions, obviously I would predict that we would end up somewhere in the middle. In particular, I think a lot of the problems of governance are indeed resolved at the level of the private intermediary. So, for example, to take the hate speech example, there could be social networking communities which have very strict regulation of various forms of expression that are deemed offensive, and there could be other ones that have very little regulation, and people will choose between them. And I would like to see a framework, and I would predict that we should move towards a framework that will allow that kind of diversity to flourish, so that so much of the governance problem is internalized by the operators. And as long as there's a certain degree of pluralism, I think that works. And so one of the key governance questions around which you might want to make a prediction is the role of what we might call competition policy, or what we call here antitrust, in breaking up or leaving alone various forms of market dominance. And again, I have no idea how that's going to play out. I think it's all of these things are path dependent, historically contingent, not entirely based on rationality. So it's very hard to predict how these things come out. I mean, if Oprah Winfrey gets gets in a dander about something and puts it on her show, we could have legislation tomorrow. I'm afraid that's the way politics kind of works. So predictability is something I'm really shying away from.
So contrary to Anne's complaint, women can rule net policy after all, or at least one woman.
One woman.
I want to give Shane the last word, so she can sort of respond to everybody. So, Chris, what do you think?
I agree that I think intermediaries are going to play a much larger role. I was going to say, notwithstanding the First Amendment in Section 230, Professor Goldman's great area of expertise, but probably because of the First Amendment in Section 230. I think they're going to feel freer to respond to consumer demands to do something about problems that are perceived in the internet community. I am concerned though about the transparency of that and input of people who use those services, precisely because Facebook and Google are pretty big and they don't right now have any strong competition. But you would hope that there would be enough transparency and input that consumers would be happy with the result.
So Shane, how does this apply in your world?
I just think that Adam's evolutionary dynamism, I can't say the word, was not on the freshman reading list for this new class of congressmen, and maybe it should be, because it could expand their horizons. I think right now we're still at a case, we don't really have perfect answers to a lot of this, so a lot of it is handling at the right layer. I mean, you've got addressing, routing, and the transport layer, and however you can get that to the most localized entity to the group that is concerned about it is ideal for us versus trying to go to the top of the house. What I say is people think they find this elegant solution of just take it out of the zone, just take it out of COM, just take it out of the root, which has really long-term implications, which I don't want to see us suffer. So I think it's going to be an ongoing dialogue. It's very important that we continue to have it and not let the short, easy answers win.
Well, before we take questions, I just want to mention that there is one other lady that's actually been quite important here, which is Virginia Pestrel, who wrote the book that Adam and I reference, and then when you read the introduction to the book that I wrote, you'll see I weave into all of this. And her 1998 book, The Future and Its Enemies, is the book that has shaped my entire approach to this world. It's the book that brought me here to do internet policy, and it is that book that I think really well describes the conflict between people who are focused on dynamic technological change and people who have this, what she calls the static mentality of looking at what Adam called short snapshots. And I think probably this panel tends heavily towards evolutionary dynamism, and some of the panels earlier this morning maybe not so much so. So I want to take questions from the audience. If Steve has a question, I will ask that somebody else ask the question first. Larry, please.
I don't think you should punish enthusiasm.
Hi, Larry Downs. Something that Shane said, and seeing my one-time boss, David Johnson, up there, reminds me of an exercise I once used to do where I looked at a couple of UN efforts to legislate new frontiers and compare the Law of the Sea Convention, which is very complicated, very contentious, with the Law of Outer Space and the Law of the Moon treaties, which are essentially one page and not particularly detailed. And obviously the difference between them is the difference is how much activity, what's going on out there, activity of all kinds. When you think about how frontier law develops, take the U.S. example, oftentimes as the activity gets interesting enough that jurisdictions form, one of the things that happens is you start by importing somebody, you take the common law of England, you say, that's our starting point. But, stone walls versus barbed wire fences, the law doesn't really work very well, so you start to adapt it. And eventually you come up with an organic form of law that's suitable to the unique environmental properties of that frontier. And interesting enough, what Frederick Jackson Turner said was ultimately the law of the frontier moves back to the people that colonized it, and the law of the U.S. effectively is the law of the frontier, went back from west to east. So I'm wondering from that what you think of the idea that none of this really matters in the sense that the frontier and the internet here as a frontier is going to create its own law organically anyway. It may be violent, it may be non-violent, it may be nicely done, or it may be unnicely done, but ultimately it doesn't really matter what jurisdictions of the old world try to do or don't do. It's going to form its own body of law that fits its unique environmental properties.
So what that's a much nicer version of what Andrew was saying this morning, maybe, that law professors are not the best predictors.
Actually, if I can grab onto that, because I watched Jon Stewart last night, and Neil deGrasse Tyson was his guest, and he was awesome. And so kind of what you just were talking about is everybody here assumes we know the law of the moon, which is only a page, so it seems simple, and now we try to apply it to Mars. And he was saying to Jon Stewart, if you don't plan your trip to Mars accurately, you would be stuck there for a year and a half. And of course, John was like, "Well, then I guess you really need to plan." So I think it's the same idea. You sometimes think that there's something that's very practical that we all know, and then we just extend it to the next universe, which is a little bit. I mean, I'm going to have to look up. I'm sure one of you with a computer in front of you have looked up the law of the moon, and if you'll email it to me, I'd appreciate it.
We have an expert here, actually, my friend Jim Dunstan.
All right.
But David,
I think it's a useful analogy, but it depends on the character of the people, as Tocqueville would say. In effect, David Post in his book talks at length about Jefferson's great foresight in deciding that new states to the west should become self-governing and not governed by rules imposed from the east. So I think it's a useful analogy, but it's not inevitable, and it's certainly not inevitable as a result of the technology. It's a function of whether fully formed, functional, and responsible communities create some degree of self-ordering.
Yeah, it's that old joke, the cartoon of the guy sitting at his desk saying, "Today I plan to be spontaneous." So, if we're to believe, it's a problem that extreme Marxists have and some extreme Hayekian libertarians have, which is just let her rip, the laws of nature will play themselves out. Then, okay, we don't need to be here. We don't need to be talking. We could be like drinking beer and watching movies. But I suspect that that's not the way the world works. Again, even though I'm not a determinist, I believe that you have to think and act and make up your strategies. And even though they're frequently wrong and have to be adjusted in midstream, it does affect what happens.
And Milton, there, you said something earlier about Section 230 being exactly the kind of strategy that could let dynamism, let evolution take its course. I mean, how central is that to your vision of liberalism in the future?
Well, not in a too literal sense, but the idea of a rule that at one stroke sort of clarifies what you have an obligation to do and what you don't have an obligation to do, is just an example of a general principle, which is how orders or rules can enhance freedom. And so we need to maybe come up with more precise tests of how rules do that and how they don't do that. But Section 230 is important because of the way it basically liberates online service providers from trying to censor and control the content that they're handling. And I don't know what the equivalent of that would be in other domains, but it's a good example. That's all.
I'm really curious to hear Josh, who does happen to work at a certain agency, but is not representing them today. Josh, what do you think?
I guess my question is perhaps designed to better understand what you believe rather than to argue. But as an example, the most popular social networking site in Russia is not Facebook, but VKontakte. This is a site, it's in a .ru domain. The servers are in Russia, the owners are in Russia. If the Russian government wants something to happen with respect to any data on that server, any account on that server, I don't know, but I suspect that they're going to be able to make that happen. Whether it's under Russian law or pursuant to some extra legal means, it's going to happen. When you talk about an autonomous global polity that might take over the internet, practically speaking, what does that mean for the users of VKontakte? How are you going to wrench from the Russian government the current control it has over that site? And wouldn't an American user who decides to create an account on VKontakte quite logically and reasonably expect that it's going to be Russian law that will govern that user's experience of VKontakte? Wouldn't it be reasonable to say that that user really has given the Russian government, or at least that particular website, a fair amount of power?
Sure. But is there an escape valve? Can that person, instead of joining this Russian social networking site, can they join another one and in that way be liberated from the obvious top-down controls on that particular social networking site? And should we, as policy advocates for the internet, should we say, oh, it doesn't matter, whatever country that you happen to be registered in, just abide by their laws, or should we try to say, maybe this community can be self-governing in some way?
How does that happen?
How does it doesn't happen for a Russian state-established and controlled social networking site. It doesn't. I understand that.
No, yeah, nobody's questioning the ability of the local government to have an impact on people who reside locally, and I do think there is a question if we're successful with this internet thing, and we generate communities of people who are coming from all over. It's not very workable to say, well, everyone's and are hosted all over, and maybe in the cloud, so you don't even know where the server is at any given time. It doesn't help to say, well, every local jurisdiction can impose its law, and everyone's consented to be governed by multiple jurisdictions. In the clear cases where the rules are all the same, where child porn is universally forbidden, that's not so much of a problem. In the cases where the question presented is, when should you kick someone off for saying something uncivil, or intermediate cases like that, the most logical way to establish the rules is to have the owner, mediator, moderator of the site set them, and then let people decide whether they want to go there. So I agree with you. In a sense, going to a site is granting them jurisdiction. But the question is, are there many places to go, and is there ample room for voices that are reasonable and congruent?
We have time for two more questions. Jim?
And no, I'll spare the space law lecture. One of the sort of presumptions in this whole panel, it seems to me, is that traditionally there has been somewhat a hands-off approach to regulating the internet. What I think we are beginning to see, however, is certain countries and even some states, to take this down the other level, sort of realizing, wow, we can actually be the tail that wags this dog. Some of us were involved in the main, Little COPPA, Act, and I know as a practicing attorney, I had several of my clients that basically said, we're just not going to offer services to residents of Maine if this goes through, because it's just so onerous. Similarly, when I write a terms of service now, I have a whole separate paragraph. If you're a resident of California, you have these rights under the California privacy statute. How do we keep, or do you think there is going to be more of this sort of tail wagging the dog of jurisdictions basically realizing that they can have transborder and transnational impact by simply stepping into what is somewhat a vacuum right now in certain areas of regulating the internet?
I think you identified the basic defense, which is that if overly regulating services causes them to be cut off, at some point the people who value those services will go to their local government and say, wait a minute, we want to be part of global commerce.
And a counterexample would be the case involving the shipment of liquor ordered online across state lines that eventually was struck down. I'm waiting for a Commerce Clause challenge to one of these state laws. I'm surprised one has never been brought, but you're right. The highest common denominator becomes the national rule, and for those who like the protections that it provides, it's not a bad thing, but who said that the policymakers in Sacramento get to decide what the standard is in Washington, D.C.?
So, Shane, how does this translate nationally? I mean, David or Milton mentioned earlier the prospect of a net partitioning.
Well, so actually I was thinking just the antithesis of what you're talking about, because Kentucky was a case with gaming laws, is in the new top-level domains, again, were .dog and ICANN. They actually were suggesting, and I'm not sure this is actually out, that they can change all contracts at will. So then you're kind of wondering, why do I have a contract? And that kind of flips it all on its head.
You mean as the operator of the new
Yeah,
registry.
exactly. Like if they decide unilaterally they want to change an element of the contract which everybody's running under, now ICANN's in charge of everything. It's not Kentucky, it's not Maine. You know what I mean? So that's a whole other frightening long diatribe we can have over cocktails. But it's so it's really kind of at what level do you want that lever to be, and how much leverage do you want to have? And I personally want it as local as I can get it, and I don't want to see a galactical body or whatever it tends to be running some of this stuff because they don't seem to be accountable to anybody at the end of the day either. So that's a huge challenge.
But on the other hand, you also don't want to see the internet totally break up into small, locally governed pieces.
Right. Well, I mean, that's why I say when you go back to the the addressing, the routing, and the transport layer, this is certain layers need to not be looked at. The .com runs around the world. It doesn't have a localized layer unless you decide you want to block it at a very local ISP. I don't want to have to take something out of the root to make your point.
So Steve, I think, has the last question here. Sorry for picking on him.
Enthusiasm wins in the end, Steve.
Well, while he's coming up, I just want a quick question for Milton. Does your denationalized liberalism apply the same way at every layer of the internet, if that makes sense? In other words, are there certain layers of the internet where you would apply things differently for the reasons that Shane just mentioned? Are there some layers where you can't have local or self-governance because it breaks up the internet?
The whole point of denationalization is to have. I'm short-circuiting the idea of layers. I know too much about the internet. So the internet is layer 3, right? And TCP/IP is layer 4. Are we using some other notion of layers that has nothing to do with the protocols and the software? I'm not sure what we're talking about here. But what I think you mean is that different processes associated with the internet, would different principles apply? And I think the point is that at the layer that holds everybody together, if you want to call it a layer, the global compatibility, that is actually what empowers and enables local administration, right? I can set up routers and gateways on my network that decide to filter things at my will, okay? And in some respects, I may be subject to certain local laws or certain market forces which allow me to require me to adapt my own preferences, but the point is I still have a global internet as long as the names and numbers are governed globally and in a minimalistic way. You see, that's why we get so up in arms when you start fiddling with that for political purposes. We want the fundamental technical administration to be both globalized, minimal, and highly neutral in the good sense of net neutrality, in the sense that we don't care whether your string says shit or God. We care about whether it's unique and works globally.
So I was just going to add to your understanding, not wanting to know the layer. The root zone operators, we're the only company that actually has a contract. I mean, and they still get along very well to this day. If they could, they'd meet in a layer. I mean, it's worked, and a lot of it's because they just fundamentally believe what they do is keeping the glue of what's going together, and they are able to put their their blinders and their earmuffs on when people come in and want them to do things they don't want to do, and it's really kind of the will of their human existence is quite amazing. So it is sort of, there's certain layers that you can't really explain that
So
work.
principles do matter. So
Yeah.
last question is Steve's.
Thanks, Berin. Steve Delbianco with NetChoice. I guess it pays off to be patient. Today, with respect to 2020, you've all been somewhat descriptive, you've been predictive, and normative. But I discovered last year when we were working on the Internet Governance Forum that a lot of the other intergovernmental bodies want to simply be provocative when they analyze the 2020. So they analyze scenario thinking. So we embraced scenario thinking and created 3 scenarios for the Internet governance in 2020. And we presented the scenarios both at IGF USA and also at the Internet Governance Forum in Lithuania with an amazing result. The point of these scenarios is you lay out in 2020 a world and you describe how it's plausible that you would get there, and you ask people to say what steps should you take to avoid or enable what you like and don't like at the scenarios. But real quickly, the 3 scenarios, one was the notion of Internet islands, that nations would have their own laws that would cover behavior. They'd have separate DNS. You can balkanize the DNS. It's easy to do. They do censorship. similar to what Chris talked about. A lot of people at IGF figured that's already happening. Second scenario was that users would reign, that we would really replace the nation state with Milton's notion of the new polity, and that the private sector and civil society would work together and diminish the importance of what nation states want. But the third scenario was the one I described in my first question today, the scenario driven by business and citizens being wigged out over abuse and bad behavior on the internet. It's a scenario where intergovernments save the internet. Places like the United Nations and the ITU step in, and nations do treaties to manage things. And so I would ask you this, the way you boil a frog is you don't crank the water up, you turn it up a little bit at a time so that it doesn't jump out. And I fear that the water's being turned up a little bit at a time on these scary scenario of intergovernment saving the web. So looking at the things that are going to happen in the next year, the incremental turn up of the heat, what decisions or actions do you see where it's critical for us to get it right to either avoid a bad scenario or to enable the scenario that you want?
Well, my answer to that would be we need to think hard about the federated identity layer as a way of enabling people to decide with whom they want to exchange content and when they want to give information to someone because they trust them. Because the forms of and that's a function not just of technologies but also of developing contracts that provide a governance on people who play those roles for us. So we have to keep working on empowering. I guess my second reaction is, the question is whether the frog that's being boiled is the nation state or the internet. And, I saw something interesting recently describing the world as becoming increasingly unnational, meaning that it's becoming either local or global, and that many activities now take place through groups of people who are drawn from all over. So, and my third answer is, the most important thing we can do is imagine the scenario that we want.
That's what I said in my chapter, that we have to know what we want to do. So I'll pick a very narrow thing. I think identity is important, but something even more narrow that we can actually think about, get our mind around fixing is the role of governments in ICANN, right? The GAC. I mean, can we just fix that, please, and and do that right, and try to work out an accountability framework for ICANN in which we can say, okay, we have a global private sector institution that is nevertheless, while it is independent of national governments and national law, it is nevertheless accountable to some kind of global polity in a way that works. And it does not have this little pimple, this growing tumor called the GAC, which is displacing that role.
Chris?
I think if we don't pay attention to privacy online and hate speech online, we will see balkanization in other countries that will make my vision of the global internet not what I want it to be.
Shane, you have the last word.
I think the key is actually education throughout all the layers, because if people had waited for permission, we wouldn't have the internet. If they would have asked, if they'd gone to all the people they think should have signed off on it, we'd never be where we are today. So I think that it's a very valid concern, though. I don't want the frog to be the internet.
Well, please join me in thanking this panel. And